Jackson had been a truck driver for as long as he could remember. For over 20 years, he had driven through countless miles of empty roads in small towns, delivering goods from one corner of the country to the other. Late nights on lonely highways didn't scare him, and he was used to the strange things that can happen out on the open road. But one night on Highway 23, Tom encountered something that would change him forever. It was October, and the air had a chill to it. Tom was driving through the mountains of Colorado on his way to deliver a shipment of electronics to a warehouse in Kansas. The road was winding, and the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. Tom's headlights cut through the darkness, but the feeling of isolation was overwhelming. He hadn't seen another car in hours. As he drove, Tom's CB radio crackled with static, the occasional garbled voice coming through, but nothing he could make out. He tried a few different channels, hoping to find some company on the airwaves, but all he got was more static. Then, out of nowhere, a voice came through. It was soft and low, barely audible over the static. "Tom, can you hear me?" Tom frowned. How did they know his name? He hadn't spoken to anyone all night, and his CB was on a private channel. He turned the volume up, hoping to catch more of what the voice was saying. "Tom, it's time." The voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was something about it that made Tom's skin crawl. He grabbed the microphone, his voice shaky. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" There was no response, just silence on the other end. Tom put the microphone back, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. It was probably just a prank, he told himself, some kid with a CB radio trying to mess with truckers. But as he drove on, the feeling of unease grew. The road was empty, and the only sound was the hum of his engine and the occasional creak of his truck as it bounced over the uneven pavement. Tom glanced in his mirrors, half expecting to see someone following him, but there was nothing there, just darkness stretching out behind him. After a while, he began to relax, convincing himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But then, as he rounded a bend, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. There, in the middle of the road, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend into the night. Tom hit the brakes, his truck screeching to a stop just a few feet from the figure. His heart pounded as he stared at the figure, trying to make out any details. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching him with empty eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Tom's hands trembled as he reached for the CB radio. "This is Tom Jackson. Is anyone out there? I think there's someone in the road." But there was no response, just the same eerie static. Tom's gaze flicked back to the road, but the figure was gone. It had vanished into thin air. Tom's heart pounded as he stared at the empty road. He could have sworn there was someone there, but now there was nothing, just the dark stretch of highway in front of him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Get a grip, Tom," he muttered. "You're just tired." He put the truck back in gear and continued down the road, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The road was empty, and the silence was deafening. For the next few miles, Tom kept glancing in his mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing behind him. But the road remained empty, and he began to relax again, convincing himself that it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But then, just as he was beginning to feel calm, he heard the voice again. "Tom, you can't run from Tess." Tom's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. The voice was clear this time, echoing through the cab of his truck as if someone were sitting right next to him. He felt a chill run down his spine, a feeling of dread settling over him. He glanced in the mirror again, and his heart stopped. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road behind him, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Tom's hands shook as he watched it grow smaller in the mirror, but no matter how far he drove, the figure stayed the same distance away, as if it were following him. He hit the gas, his truck roaring as he sped down the highway, desperate to put as much distance between himself and the figure as possible. But when he glanced in the mirror again, it was still there, watching him with those unblinking eyes. "What do you want?" Tom shouted, his voice shaking. The CB crackled, and the voice came through again. "It's time to pay for your sins, Tom." Tom's heart raced as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing. He didn't know what the voice was talking about. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least nothing he could think of. He was just a truck driver, doing his job. But the voice didn't stop. It repeated the same words over and over, a chant that seemed to echo through the cab of his truck. "It's time to pay. It's time to pay." Tom couldn't take it anymore. He slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. He jumped out of the cab, his heart pounding as he looked around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. The road was empty, stretching out into the darkness on either side. The trees were silent, their branches swaying in the cold night air. Tom's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stood there, his hands trembling. And then he saw it. The figure was standing just a few feet away, its eyes fixed on him with a cold, unfeeling gaze. It raised a hand, pointing directly at him, and Tom felt a chill run through his entire body. "You can't run, Tom," the figure said, its voice low and hollow. "You have to pay." Tom took a step back, his heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't move, its gaze never wavering. "You know what you did. It's time to pay the price." Tom shook his head, his mind racing. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to get out of there. He turned and ran back to his truck, his heart pounding as he jumped into the cab and slammed the door. He hit the gas, his truck roaring as he sped down the highway, leaving the figure behind. But even as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the figure was still out there, waiting for him. For the rest of the night, Tom drove, his eyes darting to the mirrors, his heart pounding with every shadow that flickered in the darkness. He didn't stop until he reached the nearest truck stop, where he parked his truck and stumbled out, his hands shaking. But even as he stood there, surrounded by the bright lights and the sounds of other truckers, he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, watching him, waiting for the moment when he would be alone again. And deep down, Tom knew that no matter how far he drove, he would never be able to escape it. The figure would always be there, a silent reminder of the price he had to pay. Rick Jackson had been a truck driver for most of his life. He was familiar with late nights on lonely highways, the endless hum of the engine, and the shadows that flickered in his rearview mirror. But he'd never been afraid until one cold October night on an isolated stretch of highway. Rick was hauling a load through the Nevada desert, a route he'd driven many times before, but something about that night felt off from the start. The sky was darker than usual, and even with his headlights, it was like the road stretched into pure blackness, swallowing everything in its path. He hadn't passed a single car for over an hour, and the silence was weighing on him. His radio crackled, but it was nothing but static. He tried a few different channels, hoping for some music or a fellow trucker to break the silence, but every channel was just the same, endless, eerie static. "Must be the mountains interfering," he muttered, though he knew the desert wasn't known for its radio problems. Still, he turned off the radio, leaving only the sound of his truck's engine to keep him company. A yawn escaped him as he checked the clock. It was just past midnight. He still had about 3 hours left before he'd reach the nearest rest stop, where he could grab a hot coffee and maybe catch a quick nap. The thought of that coffee kept him going, even as his eyes grew heavy. He rubbed them, trying to shake off the drowsiness, and that's when he saw it, a pair of headlights far back in his rearview mirror. At first, Rick thought it was just another trucker, but as the lights drew closer, something felt wrong. The truck behind him was speeding, approaching too fast for these quiet, empty roads. Rick kept an eye on it, half expecting it to pass him, but it didn't. Instead, the truck came right up behind him, almost tailgating, its headlights blazing into his mirrors. Rick squinted against the glare, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Go on ahead if you're in such a hurry." But the truck didn't pass. It stayed right behind him, its lights cutting into his cab like two bright, unblinking eyes. Rick's nerves began to fray. There was plenty of room on the highway, so why wasn't this truck going around him? He honked his horn, hoping the driver would get the message, but the truck didn't budge. It just stayed there, right on his tail, its headlights a constant glare. Rick sped up, trying to shake the truck, but the vehicle behind him matched his speed. No matter how fast he went, it stayed close, practically breathing down his neck. It was starting to feel like the driver behind him wasn't just being careless. It was like they were following him. Just then, The CB radio crackled to life. "Pull over, Rick," a voice said. It was low and gravelly, sending a chill down Rick's spine. Rick's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't spoken to anyone on the radio all night, and there was no reason for anyone to know his name. He reached for the radio, trying to steady his shaking hand. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice sounding small and uncertain. There was silence for a moment, then the voice came through again, calm and unyielding. "Pull over now, Rick." Rick's grip tightened on the wheel. His instinct was to ignore the voice and keep driving, but something in the tone told him this wasn't just some prank. He glanced in the mirror at the truck behind him. Its headlights were as bright as ever, glaring into his eyes. "Whoever you are, I'm not pulling over," Rick said, trying to sound firm. The radio crackled again. "You can't run, Rick. It's time to pay up." "Pay up?" Rick whispered to himself. None of this made sense. He'd never heard a voice like that before, and he didn't owe anyone anything. Suddenly, the headlights behind him blinked off. Rick looked in his rearview mirror, but there was nothing there, just empty road stretching into the darkness. He let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. He didn't know what had just happened, but he was glad it was over. "Just some weirdo messing with me," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But as he turned his attention back to the road, his headlights illuminated something up ahead. Standing in the middle of the highway was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure, dressed in dark clothes, with a face that was obscured by shadows. Rick's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. His truck came to a stop just feet away from the figure. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the figure took a step toward him. Rick's hand went to the door handle, his instincts screaming at him to get away. But he was frozen, paralyzed by the strange figure standing in front of his truck. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. Rick could see his face now, pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "Get out of the truck, Rick," the figure said, his voice low and hollow, like a whisper carried by the wind. Rick shook his head, his voice trembling. "No way. I don't know who you are, but I'm not getting out." The figure's mouth twisted into a cold smile. "You can't escape. You've been driving this road too long. It's time to pay the toll." Rick's mind raced. He didn't know what the figure meant, but he knew he had to get away. He slammed his foot on the gas, the engine roaring as he sped forward, straight through the figure. But when he looked back, the road was empty. The figure was gone, vanished into the night. He drove as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever he had just seen. After a few miles, he began to relax, convincing himself that it had all been a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He tried to focus on the road, telling himself he'd be at the rest stop soon. But then he saw them again, the same headlights, far back in his mirror, coming closer. "No," Rick whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. The truck behind him was back, its headlights bright and unrelenting. It was coming for him again, faster this time, like it knew he was trying to escape. Rick's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing. The radio crackled once more. "You can't outrun this, Rick. The road always catches up to those who've gone too far." Rick's heart pounded as he pushed the pedal to the floor, the truck speeding down the empty highway. But no matter how fast he went, the other truck stayed right behind him, its lights never wavering. "Leave me alone," Rick shouted into the night, his voice filled with desperation. But the truck didn't leave him alone. It stayed close, following his every turn, its headlights like eyes in the darkness, unblinking and cold. Just then, a sharp curve appeared in the road. Rick took it too fast, his tires skidding on the pavement. He fought to keep control, but the truck behind him was relentless, pressing closer and closer, like it was trying to push him off the road. With a scream, Rick felt his truck veer off the asphalt, the wheels slipping into the gravel. He fought to regain control, but it was too late. The truck lurched, and everything went dark. "My name is Sam, and I'm a truck driver. I've been driving for years, crisscrossing the country, delivering everything from groceries to industrial equipment. The road has become my second home, and my truck is my sanctuary. But not all my journeys have been peaceful. One autumn night, I was hauling a load of fresh produce from California to a small town in Texas. The sky was clear, and the stars twinkled like diamonds above me. I felt good that night, cruising down the highway with my favorite country music playing softly on the radio. Around midnight, I decided to stop at a rest area to stretch my legs and grab a coffee. I parked my rig under a flickering streetlight and got out. The air was cool and crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trees. I walked over to the small restroom building, glancing around to see if any other truckers were around. I noticed a few cars parked nearby, but the place felt eerily quiet. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the late hour. After using the restroom, I headed to the vending machines for a cup of coffee. As I waited for it to brew, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was crying. Curiosity piqued. I stepped outside to investigate. The sound was faint, but it was definitely coming from the direction of the woods bordering the rest area. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The crying stopped, and a moment later, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a young woman, her clothes tattered and dirty. She looked disheveled, her hair matted and her eyes wide with fear. "Please help me," she cried, her voice trembling. "I'm lost." I hesitated for a moment, remembering the stories I'd heard about hitchhikers and the dangers of picking up strangers. But something in her eyes, an unmistakable desperation, pulled at my heart. "What happened?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "I was camping with my friends, and I got separated from them," she explained, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't find my way back. I think something's out there." "Something?" I repeated, feeling a chill creep down my spine. "I don't know," she said, glancing nervously toward the trees. I heard noises. It didn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. I was so scared, I just ran. My instincts told me to turn around and get back in my truck. But I felt an overwhelming urge to help her. "All right, you can ride with me," I said. "I'm headed to Texas. We can find your friends along the way." Her face brightened with relief. Thank you so much." I led her back to my truck, and she climbed into the passenger seat. I handed her a blanket I kept in the back for cold nights. As I drove away from the rest area, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to ease the tension in the air. "Emily," she replied, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "I can't believe you stopped for me. Most people wouldn't." "I've been on the road a long time," I said. "You never know who might need help." As we drove, I tried to keep the conversation going, asking about her camping trip. She told me about her friends and their plans, but she seemed distant, glancing nervously out the window at the trees as if she expected something to leap out at us. The highway stretched on, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. I felt a growing sense of unease, but I brushed it aside, focusing on the road ahead. After about an hour of driving, I noticed that the fog had started to roll in, thick and heavy. The headlights cut through it like a knife, but the darkness felt suffocating. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I glanced around, squinting through the fog. "What?" "There's something back there," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "In the trees." I rolled my eyes, trying to shake off her fear. "It's probably just an animal or something. The fog can play tricks on your mind." But deep down, I felt a shiver of doubt. I pressed the accelerator, eager to put some distance between us and the woods. As we drove, I began to notice strange things. Shadows flitted at the edges of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Emily's breathing became shallow, and I could see her hands trembling on her lap. "Are you all right?" I asked, glancing at her. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I just have this feeling, like we're being followed." I chuckled nervously, but the sound felt hollow. "It's just the dark, Emily. We're fine." Suddenly, the radio crackled, and a voice came through, distorted and frantic. "All truckers be advised, there have been reports of strange occurrences along Route 54. If you see anything unusual, do not stop. Do not pick up hitchhikers. They may not be who they seem." My heart sank. "What the hell?" I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What did they say?" Emily asked, her eyes darting around. Just a warning," I said, trying to sound calm. But my mind raced with thoughts of what I had just seen and heard. "Sam, please," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't feel safe. Can we pull over?" "No," I snapped, feeling a surge of panic. "We need to keep moving. I'll get you to safety." The fog thickened, wrapping around the truck like a shroud. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the road felt endless. I pressed on, my heart racing with fear and uncertainty. Suddenly, I saw something flash in the headlights, an animal, or maybe a person. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. "What was that?" Emily gasped, clutching her blanket tightly. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. "I'll check it out." "Are you crazy?" she shouted. "Just drive." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "I need to make sure it's safe," I said, opening the door and stepping out into the fog. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I squinted into the darkness. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The sounds of the night surrounded me, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and something else, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I looked around, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, but only silence greeted me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure emerged from the fog, a silhouette stepping out from behind a tree. My breath caught in my throat. "Sam!" Emily screamed from the truck, her voice filled with panic. I turned to run back, but the figure stepped closer. I froze, my heart pounding. It was a man, dirty and disheveled, his eyes wild and filled with fear. "Help me!" he yelled, his voice frantic. "Please, you have to help me." "What happened?" I asked, torn between instinct and caution. "There's something in the woods," he shouted, glancing over his shoulder. "I saw it. It's hunting us." Before I could respond, Emily shouted again. "Get back in the truck, Sam, now." I hesitated, but the desperation in her voice broke through my fear. I turned and ran back to the truck, climbing inside and slamming the door shut. "What did he say?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, trying to catch my breath. He looked scared, but suddenly the low growl filled the air again, louder this time. I felt the truck shake as something slammed against the side. "Drive! Drive!" Emily shouted, panic in her voice. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life as I slammed the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was fog. "What was that?" Emily cried, gripping the seat. "I don't know," I shouted, my heart racing as I focused on the road. "Just hold on." We tore down the highway, the fog closing in around us. I could feel something lurking just out of sight, watching us. Every shadow felt alive, and my skin crawled with fear. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a small town. I pulled into a gas station, the bright lights cutting through the darkness. I parked the truck and turned to Emily. "Are you okay?" She nodded, her face pale and drawn. "I think so." "What was that thing?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But we need to get help." As we climbed out of the truck, I heard a voice calling from behind the gas station. "Hey, you two, come here." I turned to see the man from the woods stumbling toward us, his face twisted with fear. "You have to get out of here," he yelled, his voice filled with urgency. "It's coming." "Who are you?" I asked, confusion flooding my mind. "I was camping too," he gasped, looking back at the woods. "I thought I could get away, but it followed me." "You have to go before it gets you too." Emily grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't just leave. We need to get help." "Listen to me," the man shouted, his voice frantic. "It's not safe. You don't understand. It's hunting us." Just then, a deep growl echoed from the trees, making my blood run cold. I felt a surge of panic. "Get inside!" I yelled, pulling Emily toward the door of the gas station. We stumbled inside, and I slammed the door shut, locking it behind us. The cashier looked up, eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on?" "There's something out there," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "A creature, it's hunting us." "Calm down," the cashier said, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, the lights flickered, and the growl echoed again, closer this time. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I grabbed Emily's hand. "We need to find a way out of here." The cashier pointed toward the back. "There's an exit through the storeroom." I nodded and led Emily toward the back door, the growling growing louder. The man from the woods was still outside, banging on the door, desperate to get in. "Help me! Let me in!" he screamed, his voice filled with terror, but I couldn't risk it. I pushed open the storeroom door, and we stepped into the darkness. Boxes were piled high, creating a maze of obstacles. I could hear the growling outside, the sound sending shivers down my spine. "Where do we go?" Emily whispered, panic rising in her voice. "Just follow me," I said, trying to stay calm. "We'll find another way out." We navigated through the maze of boxes, my heart racing. The growling echoed outside, and I could feel the ground tremble beneath us as whatever was out there prowled around. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the front of the gas station. "Let me in," the man yelled again, but the sound was cut short, replaced by a chilling silence. "Sam!" Emily cried, gripping my arm. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we need to keep moving." We finally reached a door at the back, and I pushed it open. It led outside, but the fog had thickened, making it hard to see anything. I stepped out, and Emily followed closely behind me. The growling was louder now, echoing around us, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of safety. The gas station was behind us, but there was nothing but darkness ahead. "Where do we go?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. I looked around, my mind racing. "There, the trees." I pointed toward a line of trees not far from us. "We can hide there." As we ran toward the trees, the growling intensified. My heart raced as I pushed through the underbrush, trying to find a place to hide. We crouched behind a large tree, our breaths coming in shallow gasps. I could hear the creature moving through the darkness, its growl echoing in the night. "Sam, I'm scared," Emily whispered, her voice quivering. "I know," I replied, trying to stay calm. "But we'll get through this." The growling stopped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. I could hear rustling in the leaves, and then a shape emerged from the fog. It was massive, hulking and dark, with glowing eyes that pierced through the night. My blood ran cold as I watched it sniff the air, searching for us. "Stay quiet," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature moved closer, and I could see its jagged teeth gleaming in the faint light. My stomach twisted with fear, and I could feel Emily trembling beside me. As it prowled through the trees, I could feel its gaze searching for us. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find us. Suddenly, it stopped and turned, its eyes locking onto mine. I froze, my heart racing as it stepped closer. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her away from the tree. We bolted through the underbrush, the creature's growls echoing behind us. I could hear it crashing through the trees, chasing after us. "Faster," I urged, my lungs burning as we sprinted through the darkness. We burst into a small clearing, and I spotted an old abandoned cabin in the distance. "There!" I shouted, pointing. "We can hide in there." We raced toward the cabin, our hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear the creature closing in, its growls echoing in the night. I pushed open the door of the cabin and dragged Emily inside. The darkness enveloped us, and I quickly shut the door, leaning against it to catch my breath. "Do you think it followed us?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, peering through the cracks in the door. "We have to stay quiet." The cabin was filled with dust and cobwebs, remnants of a life long forgotten. I could hear the creature outside, sniffing around, searching for us. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "We wait for it to leave. Then we'll find a way out of here." We huddled in the corner, listening to the sounds outside. The growling was persistent, and I could hear it moving around the cabin, trying to find a way in. "Please go away," I whispered under my breath, my heart racing. Then suddenly, the growling stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, listening intently. The silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. "I don't know," I whispered. Just then I heard a scratching noise at the door. My heart raced as I backed away, pulling Emily with me. "Stay back," I whispered. The scratching grew louder, and then the door began to rattle. "It's trying to get in," Emily exclaimed, her voice rising in panic. "Shh," I hissed, my heart pounding in my chest. The door shook violently, and I could see the wood splintering under the pressure. "We have to do something," Emily cried. "Just hold on," I shouted, searching the cabin for anything we could use. My eyes landed on a rusty old axe leaning against the wall. I rushed over and grabbed it, my hands trembling as I turned back to the door. With every shake, I could feel the creature's presence growing stronger. I braced myself against the door, clutching the axe tightly. "If it gets in, we fight," I said, trying to sound confident. The door rattled again, and I could hear the creature growling, its breath heavy and labored. I glanced at Emily, her face pale with fear. "We can do this," I reassured her, though I wasn't sure myself. Then, with a final thunderous crash, the door flew open, and the creature lunged at us. I swung the axe, hitting the beast in the side. It roared in pain, but I could see its eyes filled with rage. "Run!" I yelled, pulling Emily away from the door. We dashed through the cabin, searching for another way out. I spotted a window at the back of the cabin, just large enough for us to squeeze through. "There!" I shouted, pointing. We rushed toward the window and I pushed it open. "Go, I'll follow." Emily climbed through first, her legs scrambling as she landed outside. I heard the creature roaring behind us, and adrenaline surged through me. I crawled through the window, barely making it out before the beast charged into the room. "Keep running," I yelled, sprinting toward the tree line. We bolted into the woods, dodging branches and underbrush as we ran. The growls echoed behind us, relentless and hungry. I could feel the creature gaining on us, its heavy footsteps thudding against the ground. "We need to find shelter," I shouted, scanning the area. In the distance, I spotted a clearing ahead with a small rock formation. "Over there," I called out, pushing Emily ahead of me. We reached the rocks and ducked behind them, gasping for breath. I peered around the corner, watching as the creature sniffed the air, its eyes glowing in the dark. "Please don't find us," Emily whispered, trembling beside me. The creature prowled around the area, its growl echoing in the night. I gripped the axe tightly, ready to fight if it came any closer. But then something strange happened. The creature paused, its ears twitching as if it heard something in the distance. It turned, glancing back toward the woods, and with a final growl, it bounded away, disappearing into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension lift for a moment. "Did we lose it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," I replied, my heart still racing. We waited in the shadows, listening for any signs of the creature. Minutes passed, but the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. Finally, I turned to Emily. "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here." She nodded, and we cautiously stepped out from behind the rocks, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the path ahead. "Let's go," I said, leading the way. We walked quietly, adrenaline still coursing through our veins. The night felt heavy around us, every rustle making us jump. As we continued, I spotted lights in the distance. Houses. "There," I pointed, hope flooding my chest. "We can find help." We quickened our pace, drawing closer to the lights. As we approached, I could see a small farmhouse nestled among the trees. "Maybe they can help us," Emily said, her voice filled with a mix of hope and fear. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. Moments later, an elderly man opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise. "What in the world happened to you two?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "We were being hunted by something," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "Please, we need help." The man nodded, stepping aside to let us in. "Come in, you're safe now." As we entered the warm, cozy home, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We were finally safe. "What were you running from?" the man asked, closing the door behind us. "A creature," I said, still trying to gather my thoughts. "It was hunting us." He frowned, glancing toward the window. "I've heard stories about that thing. Some say it's a lost soul, others say it's a beast that prowls the woods at night." "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The man led us to a small living room, where he offered us a seat. "You stay here for the night. I'll call the authorities in the morning." As we sat in the warmth of the house, I felt my body finally relax. We were safe, at least for now. But deep down, I knew we hadn't seen the last of that creature. The road was a dangerous place, and some things were better left undiscovered. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler. If you're ever on the road late at night, remember my story. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the fog. Always stay vigilant, and never pick up a stranger, especially in the dark.